Chapter 2. Bullets, Bombs and Bugs. Unsurprisingly, war is in fact quite dangerous. There were many different factors in World War One that could cause injury, illness and death. Though not all of these injuries came from the fighting, many of them came due to the conditions of the trenches. Our first major problem of the war is guns. More specifically, the bullets that come out of them and the wounds that they inflict. The introduction of large-scale machine guns meant that soldiers faced much more gunfire than ever before. Bullets could easily pierce vital organs. For some of the semi-automatic rifles, such as the Lee Enfield rifle, the stopping power of the bullet had increased, leading to fractured bones, particularly a bullet strong enough to break someone's femur. Despite the dangers of guns, the most dangerous feature actually was shrapnel, causing over 60% of the casualties in World War One. This often came from artillery shells which would explode and send shrapnel flying in various directions. Shrapnel was able to remove limbs, cause internal injuries, and kill soldiers if they were hit in the head. The head injuries weren't something that was expected at the beginning of the war, most of which were caused by shrapnel. This led to the army replacing soldiers' soft caps with Brody helmets which were made of metal. These reduced the number of head wounds caused by shrapnel, as it was less likely to penetrate the material. These had no effect on bullets that would hit the head, as the material was not strong enough to defend from a bullet. Stepping away from shrapnel, we move on to the weapon with the most significant psychological impact. We're talking about gas. Following its introduction at the Second Battle of Ypres, gas became something that soldiers and the British government feared. Despite this, though, it was not a major cause of death. Gas tended to cause blindness, which was mostly temporary, coughing, and sometimes it could burn the skin of the people it affected. However, to manage this, in July 1915, gas masks were issued to all British troops. Though before this happened and before they were introduced, soldiers would often wee on cotton pads or rags and cover their face with it. The major impact of gas attacks was the psychological damage that they caused. Gas created fear and also discouraged soldiers from wanting to fight the war. Gas was effective at removing soldiers from battle and caused them to take up many beds in regimental aid posts and the casualty clearing stations. Speaking of psychological trauma, we move from fear to PTSD with shell shock. Shell shock was caused by the environment that the war was fought in. The constant sounds of explosions and gunshots, plus the experiences that soldiers have had, seen, or felt during the war, caused shell shock. Some soldiers were punished for cowardice, which could even result in execution due to the shell shock, as people at the time didn't understand it. Many soldiers were treated close to the front line and encouraged to return to the fight, though some had to be evacuated to the base hospitals. This was a condition that could impact soldiers even after the war had finished. This brings us to our final points, the trench-specific illnesses. These include trench fever and trench foot, as well as ordinary illnesses that could be caught in the conditions such as cold, flu, that sort of thing. Time to step into those illnesses we talked about and discuss trench foot. This was caused from standing in waterlogged trenches and caused soldiers' flesh to rot and become gangrenous, often leading to amputation if left for too long. If a soldier lost their leg, they could no longer fight in the war, which meant the British government had to take action. Soldiers were then given whale oil and 3 pairs of socks, so that they could consistently change them. On top of this, they introduced foot inspections in the trenches and encouraged the soldiers to change their socks and reduce the number of cases of trench foot. Furthermore, in some rare instances, pumps were used to drain the trenches. Trench foot was not a disease that could be treated, which meant the key form of stopping it was prevention. Making sure that these medical officers would carry out inspections, making sure that feet were clean, making sure that feet were dry, making sure that the conditions in the trench were as good as they could be. Finally, after about 60 takes of trying to record my voice for this section of the video, we are on to trench fever. This produced flu-like symptoms which could last for months and was often a recurring issue. It was caused by lice, however it wasn't until 1918 that troops were regularly deloused to prevent it. There was no cure for trench fever, a lot like trench foot, and a soldier's condition would usually improve with clean clothes and away from the front line and the lice-infested areas there, though the case would often return upon visiting the trench once you've been sent back. Delousing and changing clothes were the only effective methods to reduce the cases of trench fever, but could not consistently reduce the number of cases due to the hygiene of the front line. Well, the lack of hygiene, I guess. It wasn't very clean. That concludes Chapter 2, and potentially the end of my sanity for this recording. I thought I was nearly done. But we need to mention an honourable mention, which is the constant risk of infection that was brought about in trench life. The conditions of the trenches, the mud, the dirt, the grime, meant that open wounds were under threat from the dirt and the chance to catch gas gangrene. The soil contained tetanus and gas gangrene bacteria because it just really didn't like the British, or the French, or the Germans, or the Italians, or any Commonwealth soldiers, or anyone really. It didn't like anyone. And this bacteria could enter the wounds during an attack or whilst the victim was lying on the ground. Just to specify, when I mean an attack, I'm talking about a bullet probably passing through someone's clothes and taking the dirt into them. The bacteria were not a Third Army in the First World War. By 1914, though, the government did take action. The British Army introduced tetanus injections to solve the problem of the tetanus. However, they didn't have a method of prevention for gas gangrene at this point.